In 1999, Esther Williams published a memoir exposing a secret buried for 38 years. She detailed walking into a hotel room and finding her lover standing in a floral dress, a red wig, and high heels. That 6'4" man was Jeff Chandler, the ultimate symbol of American masculinity and a highly profitable asset for Universal Studios. Born a working-class Jewish kid named Ira Grossel, he was forced to erase his heritage to become the perfect box office alpha male. The pressure to maintain this illusion pushed him to work until his spine collapsed on a film set, only to be coldly discarded by Hollywood on an operating table. Decades later, his entire legacy was dismantled by a single secret kept behind a locked door. The Hollywood machine of the mid-20th century was not in the business of reflecting reality. It was a ruthless industrial assembly line designed to manufacture myths. The studio system demanded gods, not ordinary men. Ira Grossel was an ordinary man. He was born in 1918, far from the manicured palm trees of California. His reality was the cold concrete pavement of Brooklyn, New York. His origin story lacked the glamour that studio publicists later tried to attach to his name. He was born into a working-class Jewish family facing the harsh economic realities of the era. The household was fractured early on. His parents separated, leaving his mother to raise him single-handedly. There was no safety net, no generational wealth, and certainly no connections to the entertainment industry. Survival was the primary objective of his childhood. The crash of 1929 had decimated the working-class neighborhoods of New York. The Grossel family felt the impact of this economic devastation daily. Breadlines and unemployment defined his environment. Young Ira watched his mother balance the crushing weight of keeping a roof over their heads. This was a generation of Americans who learned to endure quietly. Brooklyn in that era was a tough proving ground. The streets dictated a specific code of conduct for young men. Poverty was the baseline, and hard work was the only accepted currency. Ira learned early that security was a fragile concept. This deeply ingrained fear of financial instability would haunt him for the rest of his life. He attended Erasmus Hall High School, a sprawling public institution. By coincidence, he walked those halls at the same time as another future studio commodity, a girl who would later be known as Susan Hayward. But Ira did not possess the typical trajectory of a child actor or a groomed stage performer. He was pragmatic because his circumstances demanded it. Before any thought of a career in performance, he worked ordinary, invisible jobs. These early jobs grounded him in a stark reality. He was not shielded from the struggles of the working class. He stood behind a register as a cashier, handling the meager wages of ordinary people. He sat at a desk working as a layout artist, learning the mechanics of commercial production behind the scenes. He understood the value of $1 and the exhausting grind of an 8-hour shift. He was a laborer long before he was an icon. Then came the Second World War. The conflict interrupted the lives of an entire generation, and Ira was no exception. He was drafted into the United States Army and sent to the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Campaign is often forgotten in the grand narratives of World War II. It was a theater of war defined by punishing weather rather than glorious combat. Soldiers stationed there battled frostbite, depression, and endless isolation. Ira endured this silent, frozen front for a significant portion of his youth. The experience stripped away any remaining illusions of boyhood. His military record was honorable, yet completely devoid of the cinematic heroism he would later be paid to portray. The United States military during the 1940s was an unforgiving institution. The wind howled constantly, and the isolation fractured the minds of many soldiers. He survived the isolation by shutting down and following orders. He learned to project a calm exterior, a tactic that inadvertently prepared him for Hollywood. He eventually rose through the ranks to secure a commission. When the war finally ended, he was discharged with the rank of lieutenant. The man who returned to civilian life was different from the boy who had left Brooklyn. He was hardened by military discipline and isolated service. Physically, the years had left a distinct mark. His hair had prematurely turned gray in his 20s. He stood imposing at 6 feet and 4 inches tall. He possessed an undeniably commanding physical presence. Post-war America was a period of transition, and Ira found himself searching for a direction. He began taking acting classes and found work in radio, utilizing his deep, resonant speaking voice. Radio was his first real entry into the entertainment business. In the broadcasting booth, his appearance did not matter. He could portray heroes, villains, or romantic leads, relying purely on his vocal range. Radio offered a strange kind of freedom. He was judged on his performance, not on his racial background or his physical dimensions. He also joined a stock theater company, gaining practical experience on the stage. It was small-scale work, far removed from the massive sound stages of Los Angeles. But his physical attributes eventually caught the attention of talent scouts. Universal Studios saw something in him. However, they did not see Ira Grossel, the Jewish veteran from Brooklyn. They saw raw material that could be molded into a highly marketable product. The late 1940s demanded a specific type of leading man. The public wanted rugged, uncompromising Anglo-Saxon masculinity. Universal knew they could sell his broad shoulders, his height, and his striking silver hair. The very first step in this transaction was complete erasure. The studio executives deemed the name Ira Grossel unacceptable. It sounded too ethnic, too Jewish, too working class. They needed a name that sounded like it belonged on a billboard in Middle America. They stripped him of his birth name and his heritage. In a single boardroom decision, Ira Grossel ceased to exist. The mid-century studio system was notoriously prejudiced. Studio moguls, many of whom were Jewish immigrants themselves, ruthlessly scrubbed ethnic markers from their contract players. They were terrified of alienating the conservative ticket buyers of Middle America. Ira's heritage was viewed strictly as a commercial liability. The studio machinery demanded a product that was palatable, familiar, and undeniably white. Jeff Chandler was manufactured to replace him. This new identity was not just a stage name, it was a comprehensive corporate mandate. The studio crafted a persona around his rugged exterior. He was positioned as the ultimate macho man. Every press release, every photograph, and every casting decision was engineered to reinforce this illusion. The creation of Jeff Chandler was a masterclass in Hollywood marketing. Universal executives recognized that post-war audiences were hungry for a specific kind of strength. Men returning from the front wanted to see stoic, unshakable heroes on screen. Women sought a protective, powerful ideal. Chandler fit this projection perfectly. His silver hair gave him an air of mature authority, while his massive frame suggested physical dominance. He was sold to the public as the flawless American male standard. This transformation laid the foundation for a profound identity conflict. Chandler was essentially hired to play a fictionalized version of a man. The Jewish kid who knew poverty and the quiet soldier from the Aleutians had to be buried. In their place stood a flawless, invincible archetype. It was a lucrative facade, but it required constant, exhausting maintenance. Living as a studio invention required a profound level of compartmentalization. When the cameras stopped rolling, the expectations did not end. Contract players in the 1950s were monitored constantly. Studio fixers and publicists controlled who they dated, where they ate, and how they spoke in public. Chandler was forced to perform the role of the hyper-masculine leading man 24 hours a day. The boundary between the actor and the performance was deliberately destroyed. The psychological burden of this erasure started immediately. To succeed in the studio system, he had to participate actively in hiding his true self. He could not afford to let the mask slip. The executives made it clear what they were paying for. Any deviation from the rigid parameters of his manufactured masculinity was a threat to his commercial viability. This dynamic established a dangerous precedent early in his career. His physical body became corporate property, and his public identity was a carefully managed asset. The contract system of that era was essentially indentured servitude dressed up in tailored suits. Actors were property bound by 7-year contracts that gave the studio absolute control over their lives. Universal Studios did not just lease his talent, they owned his public existence. If a contract player refused a role, they were suspended without pay. The power dynamic was entirely one-sided. Ira, remembering the poverty of his Brooklyn youth, was in no position to argue. He accepted the terms because the alternative was a return to the financial insecurity he dreaded. He was rewarded with fame and money, but the currency he used to pay for it was his authenticity. The pressure to conceal any aspect of his life that did not align with the blueprint was immense. Every interview he gave was tightly scripted. Every photo shoot was heavily directed. The man inside the tailored suits was not permitted to have doubts, fears, or contradictions. The industry dictated that true masculinity left no room for vulnerability. For a man carrying the quiet traumas of a fractured childhood and military service, this was a suffocating directive. The concept of the macho man in the 1950s was rigidly defined. It was an era of strict gender conformity. The ideal American male was expected to be aggressive, emotionally closed off, and physically intimidating. There was a profound cultural anxiety in the post-war years, and Hollywood responded by selling invulnerability. Jeff Chandler became the physical embodiment of this cultural demand. He was cast as a generalized Anglo-Saxon hero, completely detached from his own ethnic identity. They sent fan mail to a man who did not exist off the studio lot. Ira Grossel had to read letters praising the courage and strength of Jeff Chandler. It was a daily reminder that his authentic self was considered worthless by the people who signed his checks. He was valued only for his ability to maintain a profitable lie. He was denied the basic human right to be complex. The machinery was ready to put him to work. He possessed the exact dimensions the industry required. He had the discipline to follow orders. The stage was set for a rapid ascent to stardom, and the first major assignment they handed him would twist his identity even further. The year 1950 introduced a script that would permanently alter the trajectory of his manufactured existence. The project was titled Broken Arrow, a Western that required a specific kind of physical presence for the role of the Apache leader, Cochise. Hollywood casting at the time had absolutely no interest in historical accuracy or ethnic authenticity. The studio executive simply needed a large frame, a stoic face, and a deep voice to anchor the picture. Jeff Chandler fit the physical dimensions required by the costume department, and that was the only qualification that mattered. The irony of this casting decision was profound and entirely ignored by the studio machinery. A Jewish man from the streets of Brooklyn was about to become the definitive cinematic face of a Native American icon. He was already hiding his own heritage under a fabricated Hollywood identity to survive in an inherently prejudiced industry. Now, he was being paid to don heavy makeup and portray a marginalized figure for the entertainment of the masses. The layers of artificiality were stacking up, burying the reality of who he was even deeper beneath the surface. When Broken Arrow was released, it became a massive commercial triumph and a critical darling. The picture was unusually progressive for its era, offering a humane and dignified portrayal of the Apache people instead of the standard savage stereotypes. Chandler's quiet, powerful performance connected with post-war audiences. His work was validated by the highest authority in the industry when he received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. To the outside observer, this was the pinnacle of success and the beginning of a limitless career. In a fair and creatively driven industry, an Oscar nomination provides an actor with the leverage to choose diverse and challenging material. However, Universal Studios was a factory, and they did not operate on the principles of artistic freedom. They looked at the staggering box office receipts and made a cold, immediate calculation regarding their asset. Chandler was no longer just a reliable leading man. He was now their highly lucrative, exclusive Indian star. The critical acclaim did not open doors for him. Instead, it slammed the cage shut and locked it tight. The mandate handed down from the studio executives was simple and uncompromising. Repeat the formula until the public stops buying tickets. He was immediately pushed into a relentless cycle of sequels and spiritual successors that exploited his new image. In 1952, he was forced right back into the heavy costumes for the battle at Apache Pass. 2 years later, he reprised the archetype yet again in Taza, son of Cochise, squeezing the final drops of revenue from the gimmick. He was trapped in a highly profitable feedback loop, playing minor variations of the exact same character. Transforming a white Jewish actor into an Apache chieftain required hours of suffocating grease paint and restrictive costumes before brutal days of physical labor in the desert heat. Universal Studios viewed his rapidly deteriorating body not as a medical concern, but as a logistical liability. Stripped of artistic autonomy, Chandler was forced to endure punishing shoots, relying on heavy chemical dependencies just to hit his marks. To the executives in Los Angeles, he was simply an expendable blue-chip asset meant to be run at maximum capacity until the machinery eventually failed. He made desperate attempts to break out of the mold, taking on different genres when the studio occasionally loosened the leash. He tried his hand at modern dramas and light comedies, hoping to prove his versatility to the decision makers. But the massive shadow of Cochise followed him everywhere, heavily influencing how audiences perceived his presence. The public had been aggressively conditioned to see him in a very specific, rugged light. When he stepped outside of that stoic archetype, the financial returns often dipped, sealing his fate. These minor box office fluctuations sent a clear and dangerous message to his employers. Do not let him experiment. They immediately tightened the leash, pulling him forcefully back to the reliable westerns and action-heavy combat pictures. The Oscar nomination, which had initially symbolized industry respect and validation, had morphed into a permanent curse. It gave the studio the ultimate justification to exploit that specific version of him indefinitely. He was trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by wealth but entirely stripped of his freedom. The financial compensation for his labor was undeniably substantial, but it served entirely as a set of golden handcuffs. He had grown accustomed to the lavish Hollywood lifestyle, and more importantly, he had massive financial obligations to maintain. The studio system intentionally kept their contract players highly dependent on the weekly paycheck to fund their required standard of living. This engineered financial dependency ensured absolute compliance and effectively crushed any lingering thoughts of rebellion. He could not afford to walk away, even as the work was systematically destroying him. He was essentially caught in an endless, punishing loop of rapid film production. There was absolutely no time granted to rest, physically recover, or reflect on the increasingly chaotic direction of his life. He was shuffled directly from one sound stage to another, often shooting multiple demanding films within a single calendar year. This relentless pace was a calculated management tactic designed to prevent actors from gaining enough leverage or clarity to negotiate better terms. He was kept exhausted, off balance, and perpetually in motion. Underneath the stoic, unbreakable expression of the Apache leader, Chandler was silently suffocating in plain sight. He was a man completely severed from his historical roots, playing a racial caricature for an industry entirely devoid of empathy. The cameras flawlessly captured the image of a hero, but they completely missed the slow erosion of the man beneath the paint. The studio had successfully and ruthlessly commodified his physical form for mass consumption. They had turned his face into a logo and his towering body into a reliable brand. This was the ultimate cold-blooded triumph of the Hollywood manufacturing machine. They possessed the power to take a complex, traumatized human being and flatten him into a two-dimensional, profitable icon. But this specific kind of industrial exploitation always exacts a heavy price from the human machinery it utilizes. The physical and mental toll of the Broken Arrow era laid the concrete groundwork for the tragedies that would soon follow. The chronic fatigue and the continuous, unyielding strain on his body were quietly and irreversibly accumulating. He was essentially borrowing health, energy, and sanity from his future to satisfy the studio's immediate present demands. The bill for this intense multi-year exploitation was inevitably going to come due, and the cost would be absolute. Chandler's experience with typecasting served as a masterclass in psychological manipulation executed by his powerful employers. They successfully convinced him that his entire worth was directly tied to his willingness to endure extreme discomfort without complaint. He was highly praised in studio memos for his strong work ethic and his reliable compliance. This praise was a calculated tactic designed to keep him docile, productive, and eager to please the executives. A compliant star is a profitable star, and the studio demanded uninterrupted profitability. The moment a contract player began to question the quality of the scripts or the physical demands, they were labeled difficult. In the rigid hierarchy of the 1950s, being labeled difficult by a major studio could end a lucrative career overnight. The paralyzing fear of losing everything he had built kept him tethered to the makeup chair. He endured the blistering heat, the heavy wigs, and the crushing creative stagnation with a quiet, desperate resignation. He was living a highly visible, globally celebrated life of profound, quiet misery. The legacy of Broken Arrow remains complicated within the broader history of American cinema. It genuinely broke new ground in its sympathetic depiction of Native Americans on screen, representing a significant historical achievement. But for the man forced to carry the weight of that representation, the film was the beginning of a prolonged structural abuse. It solidified his permanent role as a heavily utilized piece of machinery in the Universal factory. He had survived the poverty of Brooklyn and the isolation of the Aleutians, only to be broken by the very industry that made him immortal. In 1959, the carefully curated facade of his domestic life finally collapsed under the weight of his reality. Jeff Chandler's marriage to Marjorie Hochel ended in a highly publicized and deeply bitter divorce. The legal settlement was economically brutal for the actor, fundamentally changing the trajectory of his career. He was immediately saddled with massive alimony payments and substantial long-term child support obligations. This sudden financial burden effectively eliminated any possibility of stepping back from his grueling production schedule. He was now trapped on a treadmill of endless labor, stripped of the power to decline work. He was forced to accept nearly every script handed to him just to stay financially solvent. Universal Studios quickly recognized this profound desperation in their highly bankable star. They knew their contract player could no longer afford the luxury of negotiation script approval or physical rest. The executives immediately accelerated his output to maximize their return on his remaining years of viability. They pushed the Silver Fox persona into a relentless string of physically demanding action films and westerns. The studio essentially weaponized his personal financial obligations against him to ensure absolute compliance. They capitalized on his urgent need for cash, extracting maximum labor from an increasingly exhausted asset. There were absolutely no meaningful breaks scheduled between these intense cinematic projects. He transitioned directly from one punishing location shoot to the next without a moment of recovery. His bank accounts drained almost as quickly as they filled, creating a terrifying cycle of dependency. The American public saw a wealthy, successful movie star living the ultimate Hollywood dream. The grim reality was a man operating under the crushing weight of continuous, inescapable debt. The divorce had stripped away his financial security, leaving him entirely vulnerable to the industry. He was entirely dependent on the very system that was systematically breaking down his physical and mental health. Amidst this relentless work schedule, Chandler entered a highly visible relationship with Esther Williams. She was widely known as the $1 Million Mermaid, a massive box office draw, and an international celebrity. Their pairing was a studio publicist's absolute dream scenario, designed for maximum media exposure. It was a perfect convergence of Hollywood royalty that generated endless headlines in the entertainment press. To the outside world, this romance was the ultimate validation of his hypermasculine dominant image. The press eagerly documented their relationship, cementing his status as the ultimate American alpha male. The studio happily encouraged and facilitated the public spectacle of their courtship at premieres and restaurants. This high-profile relationship acted as a highly convenient and impenetrable shield against rumors. It deflected any unwanted scrutiny away from his private life and the internal struggles he was hiding. He was playing the role of the virile leading man both on the sound stage and in the gossip columns. It was a rigidly required performance to maintain his vital commercial viability in a conservative era. The illusion of complete perfection was his primary currency in an industry that sold fantasies. But behind the closed doors of expensive, heavily guarded hotel rooms, a different narrative was unfolding. The continuous pressure of maintaining this flawless facade was actively fracturing his psyche. The rigid expectations of 1950s manhood were proving to be an unbearable, suffocating weight on his shoulders. He desperately needed an escape from the heavy, suffocating armor of the Jeff Chandler persona. The specific mechanism of his escape would not be known to the public for several decades. The truth remained completely hidden from the world until the year 1999, long after his death. It was then that Esther Williams published her revealing autobiography, The $1 Million Mermaid. Her written account provided a jarring, unprecedented look behind the curtain of his heavily protected life. Walking unannounced into their shared hotel suite one evening, she confronted a reality that defied every public narrative about her partner. What she witnessed completely dismantled the studio's billion-dollar illusion of his rugged, unyielding masculinity. He had found his only genuine peace by stepping outside the strict boundaries of his assigned gender. The man the public knew as an impenetrable alpha male was desperately seeking relief in the exact opposite presentation. This was not a comedic performance or a temporary lapse in judgment to prepare for a role. It was a fundamental aspect of his identity that had been buried alive by the industry machinery. He confessed to her that he enjoyed the practice and that it brought him a rare sense of comfort. In the suffocating, highly conservative cultural climate of the 1950s, this revelation carried catastrophic implications. Hollywood operated under strict, unforgiving moral clauses enforced by powerful, ruthless studio fixers. These men were employed specifically to erase any behavior that deviated from rigid American norms. A secret regarding personal gender expression was a direct, immediate threat to a lucrative career. If the ticket-buying public discovered the truth behind the silver fox, the consequences would be swift. His immense box office value would have instantly dropped to zero, rendering him entirely worthless. The studio executives would have canceled his contract and aggressively moved to seize his assets. They would have banished him from the entertainment industry without a single moment of hesitation. Chandler was acutely and constantly aware of these massive, life-altering stakes every time he dressed. He knew that his professional and financial survival depended entirely on his ability to keep the door shut. Hiding his true self was not merely a personal preference or a simple matter of maintaining privacy. It was a strict, non-negotiable occupational requirement imposed by his employers to protect their investment. He was acting for his life every single hour of the day, both on and off the studio clock. The profound paranoia of being discovered added a crushing layer of anxiety to his daily existence. His secret was simply an unspoken liability, a ticking clock that the studio hoped to outrun. Chandler was caught in a vicious, highly destructive, and self-perpetuating cycle of his own making. The expensive divorce forced him to work more hours under increasingly harsh and unforgiving conditions. The massive workload significantly deepened his physical exhaustion and clouded his mental state. The severe exhaustion intensified his desperate need for a private, secret escape from his public persona, and the desperate need for that escape amplified his terror of being exposed to the hostile press. This paralyzing fear forced him to work even harder to project and maintain the flawless masculine illusion. He was trapped in an invisible prison built jointly by Universal Studios and his own financial ruins. The system demanded absolute conformity and punished any deviation with total, irreversible destruction. He was a prisoner of his own highly profitable face and his commanding masculine voice. The studio machinery viewed his internal conflicts as completely irrelevant as long as he hit his marks. They required a rugged hero, and he obediently provided the raw material for that cinematic projection. The psychological splitting required to survive this duality was immense and ultimately unsustainable. He was a man divided into two completely separate, incompatible entities living in the same body. One was celebrated globally, while the other was condemned to the shadows of locked hotel rooms. Esther Williams eventually ended the relationship, unable to reconcile the two radically different versions of the man. Her departure removed one of the few genuine emotional anchors he had left in the Hollywood ecosystem. He was left completely alone with his dangerous secret, his mounting debts, and his grueling production schedule. The isolation only deepened his reliance on his carefully constructed public armor to survive the days. He had no one left to confide in, finding no safe harbor in an industry built on ruthless exploitation. The continuous, unyielding stress began to manifest more prominently in his physical health and overall demeanor. The studio simply adjusted the lighting to hide the deepening lines of chronic exhaustion on his face. They continued to book him on physically demanding shoots in remote, punishing locations without hesitation. The executives operated on the dangerous assumption that his massive frame could withstand infinite punishment. They were systematically driving a luxury vehicle at top speed without ever checking the integrity of the engine. He became increasingly dependent on pain management just to execute basic blocking on the massive sound stages. The flawless facade was beginning to show microscopic cracks, but the industry willfully chose to ignore them. As long as the box office receipts remained steady, the underlying reality was entirely irrelevant to the board. The violent collision between his failing physical body and the studio's endless demands was inevitable. The stage was rapidly being set for a final catastrophic failure of the human machine they had built. He operated without a safety net. The 1950s studio system was a strict extraction operation built to convert charisma into capital. Chandler generated reliable returns, but the physical foundation sustaining that output was fracturing. He was surrounded by agents, managers, and publicists who relied entirely on his income for their livelihoods. Their primary objective was to keep him working at all costs, not to ensure his long-term well-being. Any admission of vulnerability would have immediately threatened the financial security of his entire massive entourage. He was an isolated pillar supporting the immense weight of a parasitic, demanding infrastructure. The pressure from the executives above and the dependents below left him entirely immobilized. The hidden life he led in private was the only fragment of autonomy he had managed to preserve. Yet even that small fragment was heavily tainted by the constant, looming threat of total destruction. He could not seek professional intervention for his internal struggles without risking immediate exposure. Medical professionals in Los Angeles often function as direct extensions of the studio security apparatus. Confidentiality was a dangerous myth when dealing with the high-stakes assets of major film studios. He was forced to self-manage his turmoil and silently endure the slow, agonizing collapse of his life. The contrast between the confident characters he portrayed and the terrified man he was became glaringly stark. He was selling a global fantasy of invulnerability while being entirely consumed by profound vulnerability. The audiences remained completely blind to the agonizing, invisible cost of their weekly entertainment. They cheered for a phantom on the screen, while the real man quietly suffocated in the dark. April 1961 marked the beginning of a rapid and fatal countdown. The location was the dense, unforgiving jungle of the Philippines. The project was Merrill's Marauders, a grueling World War II combat picture. Universal Studios required an authentic, grimy atmosphere to sell the heroism of the narrative. They shipped their cast and crew to a hostile environment where physical comfort was entirely non-existent. Chandler was, as always, expected to deliver the required masculine stoicism, regardless of the conditions. He was 42 years old, but his body carried the mileage of a much older man. A decade of continuous punishing location shoots had severely compromised his physical integrity. He had a documented history of severe back problems, a direct result of performing countless stunts on hard terrain. His spine had been quietly deteriorating under the weight of his relentless work schedule. The studio executives were fully aware of this pre-existing condition, but chose to entirely ignore it. The production schedule for the film was tight, aggressive, and highly demanding. Any delay in the shooting timeline meant a significant loss of corporate profit. In the middle of this grueling production, the military advisors organized a baseball game with the stationed American soldiers. It was a standard public relations exercise designed to boost morale on the isolated set. Chandler, fulfilling his duty as the rugged leading man, participated in the highly publicized game. During a routine play, his deeply compromised spine finally surrendered. A sudden, sharp movement caused a massive herniation in his lower back. This was not a random, unfortunate accident on a baseball diamond. It was the inevitable structural collapse of a human body that had been overworked for years. The accumulated damage of his entire cinematic career culminated in a single agonizing moment in the dirt. The pain was immediate, blinding, and completely paralyzing. In a standard industrial setting, an injury of this magnitude would require immediate medical evacuation. But a Hollywood film set in 1961 operated outside the boundaries of normal occupational safety protocols. Halting the production to secure proper medical care for the lead actor was deemed far too expensive. The financial directives from Los Angeles were clear. The picture must be completed on time. The studio representatives on location did not view his injury as a medical emergency. They viewed it as a logistical inconvenience that needed to be aggressively managed. Chandler was not sent to a proper hospital for comprehensive evaluation and treatment. Instead, he was handed over to the set doctors, whose primary job was to keep the actors upright. He was heavily medicated with strong chemical painkillers to temporarily mask the agonizing nerve damage. He was ordered to return to the set and complete his remaining scenes. The sheer physical agony of wearing heavy military gear with a ruptured disc was unimaginable. Yet the camera kept rolling, and he was forced to continue marching through the rough jungle terrain. If you watch the final cut of Merrill's Marauders, the reality of his condition is brutally apparent. His physical movements are stiff, labored, and completely devoid of his usual fluid strength. The pain etched on his face in those final scenes is not an example of brilliant character acting. It is the unvarnished documentary evidence of a man being tortured by his own employers. The studio essentially captured his physical destruction on heavy film stock and packaged it as entertainment. He survived the remainder of the shoot relying heavily on prescription medication. By the time the director finally called a wrap, his back was entirely ruined. He was placed on a long flight back to the United States, heavily sedated and largely immobile. The moment he landed in Los Angeles, he was immediately directed to the Culver City Hospital. This specific medical facility was deeply entrenched in the broader Hollywood ecosystem. It was a place where studio executives routinely sent their valuable assets for discreet repairs. The hospital was highly accustomed to treating famous patients with a strict guarantee of total silence. The medical objective was straightforward: perform a standard spinal surgery to repair the herniated disc. It was considered a routine procedure, a mechanical fix for a broken piece of studio equipment. Chandler was assured by the medical staff that he would be back on his feet shortly. There was absolutely no indication that this standard operation would transform into a catastrophic event. He was wheeled into the operating room as a highly valuable corporate asset needing maintenance. What occurred next behind those closed surgical doors was a total catastrophic systemic failure. During the delicate process of navigating the spinal column, a critical and devastating error was made. The surgeon's scalpel slipped and severely damaged a major artery located deep within the abdominal cavity. This was not a minor surgical complication. It was a devastating, life-threatening mistake. The routine spinal repair instantly became a desperate, chaotic battle to stop a massive hemorrhage. His vital signs plummeted. A surgical error had caused a massive vascular emergency. He was kept in surgery for hours as the medical team attempted to stabilize him. Over the course of these desperate procedures, he received 55 pints of transfusions. The routine operation had escalated into a total systemic collapse. He had survived the immediate bleeding, but his heavily traumatized body was entirely defenseless. The massive influx of foreign blood and the chaotic surgical environment introduced severe complications. The Culver City Hospital, designed to silently fix the broken stars, had effectively destroyed one. Chandler lay in the intensive care unit, heavily monitored and completely incapacitated. The physical strength that had defined his entire public persona was completely eradicated. The consequences of the botched surgery manifested rapidly and aggressively. He developed septicemia, a massive systemic infection that rapidly spread through his weakened body. His compromised lungs, further weakened by the trauma and prolonged anesthesia, quickly developed aggressive pneumonia. His body was fighting a chaotic war on multiple fronts, and it possessed absolutely no reserves left. The powerful man who had commanded the screen was now entirely dependent on failing life support machines. During these final agonizing days, the silence from the Hollywood establishment was deafening. The studio executives who had relentlessly pushed him into the jungle did not intervene. There were no public statements of support or organized efforts to secure better medical specialists. Once he was severely damaged and rendered incapable of generating profit, he was immediately discarded. He was no longer a valuable asset. He was a legal and public relations liability. The transition from a highly bankable movie star to a dying man was violently abrupt. The entire process, from the initial injury on the baseball field to his final breath, took less than 2 months. He had spent over a decade meticulously building the indestructible myth of Jeff Chandler. It took the studio machinery and an incompetent medical team exactly 8 weeks to dismantle him completely. He had survived the poverty of his youth in a world war, only to have his life ended by his own industry. He passed away in the hospital bed, far removed from the fabricated glory of his cinematic adventures. The man who had portrayed countless heroes met a remarkably bleak, unheroic, and entirely preventable end. The immense physical presence that Universal Studios had aggressively monetized was reduced to a fragile, broken shell. Ira Grossel, the Jewish kid from Brooklyn, died silently under the heavy shadow of his own manufactured alias. His sudden departure sent a brief shock wave through the entertainment press, but the gears of the industry never stopped turning. The studio immediately began shifting their marketing focus to the next available contract player. The cameras on other sets continued rolling, and the rigid production schedules remained entirely unaffected. The Hollywood ecosystem had successfully consumed another life, digested the profits, and discarded the remains. But the profound negligence that caused his fatal outcome would not remain buried with him. The horrific details of his surgical ordeal were too massive to be quietly swept under the rug. The staggering volume of transfusions painted a clear picture of medical incompetence. The hospital administrators desperately attempted to frame the tragedy as an unavoidable tragic complication of surgery, but the sheer brutality of the facts demanded a thorough, independent investigation. The carefully constructed walls of the Culver City Medical Sanctuary were about to be breached. His grieving family was left to navigate the wreckage of his sudden violent exit from the world. They were handed a death certificate that heavily sanitized the brutal realities of his final weeks. The burden of seeking justice for the fallen star would not fall upon the powerful executives who employed him. It would fall squarely upon the shoulders of his heavily traumatized, underage children. The true crime aspect of his story was transitioning from physical exploitation to a bitter legal war. The California State Hospital Bureau investigated the Culver City facility immediately following his passing. The findings confirmed severe medical malpractice during the initial spinal procedure. The legal burden of holding the institution accountable fell to his two young daughters, Jamie, 14, and Dana, 12. They filed a $1.5 million malpractice lawsuit against the hospital and the two primary surgeons. In the early 1960s, a medical liability case of this magnitude was highly publicized, thrusting the grieving teenagers into a grueling public legal battle. To prevent a trial that would expose a clinic heavily utilized by the studios, the defense initiated aggressive negotiations. In February 1962, the lawsuit was settled out of court for $233,258. The hospital and surgeons issued a joint statement refusing to admit fault. Concurrently, the Hollywood establishment vanished from the narrative. Universal Studios issued no official statements. The funeral was remarkably small and restricted strictly to family and a few close friends. The executives who profited from his labor erased him from their active ledgers the moment he ceased to be a viable asset. The financial extraction continued even after the legal settlement. He left behind an estate valued at approximately $600,000, intended for his daughters. His former wife, Marjorie Hochel, immediately filed a lawsuit against the estate, demanding an additional $80,000 in allegedly unpaid alimony. The teenagers lost their father to an industrial failure, only to spend their formative years watching lawyers and former partners dismantle his remaining assets. The industry protected its image, leaving the family to handle the financial wreckage. The studio moved on, and Jeff Chandler slowly faded into classic cinema nostalgia. The manufactured image of the rugged silver fox survived intact for decades. That stability ended in 1999. Esther Williams published her autobiography, The $1 Million Mermaid, bringing a highly profitable hidden secret into the public domain. The industry had strictly enforced his silence during his career. Now that same silence was monetized by the publishing sector. When describing that fateful night in the hotel room, she wrote explicitly, "Here was my lover, a strong, manly figure by anyone's estimate, who had just been standing before me in high heels and a dress. This was no joke. He enjoyed that kind of thing. He was a cross-dresser." The reaction from older Hollywood contemporaries was swift. Jane Russell and others publicly denied the claims, accusing Williams of smearing a defenseless man to sell books. They rushed to protect the rigid 1950s masculine illusion that their own legacies relied upon. Despite the denials, his historical footprint was permanently altered. The stoic, commanding persona he maintained at the cost of his physical health was replaced in the public consciousness by a sensationalized narrative. Ira Grossel played his assigned role until his body failed on a jungle set. The studio system extracted his prime years, and decades later, the exposure of his heavily guarded private reality finalized the dismantling of his public memory.